Good evening. From Afghanistan to the Muslim Brotherhood, Saudi Arabia and Russia have been on the opposite side of almost every major global conflict for the past few decades. But now the inconceivable seems to be happening. The Saudi king is on his first ever visit to Russia, confirming the rise of Moscow as a major player in the politics of West Asia. On Gravitas tonight, we look at how Vladimir Putin has played his cards to influence the narrative, and we also discuss how he compares to the other global leader, that is Donald Trump. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. The headlines first. Iraq's Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi says his forces have liberated the town of Hawija from the Islamic State, one of the last bastions of the terror group. In an attempt to block the Declaration of Independence, Spanish Constitutional Court suspends Monday's session of the Catalan Parliament, says such a move will be a breach of the Constitution. The latest on the investigation into the Las Vegas mass shooting. Police say the attacker, Stephen Paddock, led a secretive life and meticulously planned the attack. An international chemical weapons watchdog claims that the Syrian government used sarin gas on civilians in March. Activists say the international community needs to do more to punish Assad. Also on the show, what Pakistan is up to offset the losses suffered by terrorists at the hands of the Indian security agencies in Kashmir. All you need to know about the so-called halal dastas in Pakistan. What the Venezuelan president has said to America after befriending and visiting Vladimir Putin. How the site of America's worst mass shooting is also famous for its gun tourism. And the Nobel Prize for Literature goes to none other than Kazuo Ishiguro. But first, to what's happening in Moscow. At 81, King Salman of Saudi Arabia is not known to travel very much. But a visit to Moscow was considered necessary in these uncertain times. Uncertain because of Donald Trump in the White House, who appears to place little value on old alliances, and the emergence of America as an exporter of shale oil, which has further undercut Saudi Arabia's position as the oil powerhouse of the world. But also because Russia's deft moves in Syria and its alliance with Iran are seen as political game changers in the Arab world. The Saudis are on the opposite side, whether on Syria or Iran. They are pursuing what is widely regarded as an unwinnable war in Yemen against the Shia Houthis backed by Iran. The Saudis are also regarded as having covertly backed the Islamic State. The virtual collapse of Saudi-linked armed groups in Syria has left them with hardly any leverage. It was therefore important that King Salman meet President Vladimir Putin, the man seen as the architect of Russia's resurrected superpower status. Equally important for the Russians, who on the back of the king's visit can show the world that they can build ties with key Arab countries. The Putin-Salman talks are expected later this evening, but there are some immediate priorities that both sides are perhaps looking at. Saudi Arabia, its OPEC partners and Russia had struck a deal last year. The deal was to cut oil output to support global oil prices. That deal is expected to continue well into 2018. The two leaders will sign joint investment deals worth $3 billion. This could include $1 billion in joint energy investment fund. The two countries have also been negotiating an arms deal for some time now. The Saudis, who currently spend $63 billion on defense, are reportedly anxious to diversify their purchases away from the US. Reports from Moscow have confirmed that the Saudis are keen on buying Russian transport and attack helicopters, the T-90S tanks, armored vehicles and the S-400 missile defense system. If and when the sales go ahead, it's not clear how the Saudis will integrate these platforms and systems with their largely American equipment. Washington, of course, will be watching closely. And joining us with more on this, Nandan Unnikrishnan, Senior Fellow at the ORF, someone who understands Russia very well, joining us from New Delhi, and Karen Stacy, South Asia correspondent for the Financial Times, also with us from New Delhi. Good evening to both of you. Nandan, how significant is the meeting between the Saudi monarch and Vladimir Putin?
I think it's a historic meeting. This is the first time the Saudi leader is traveling to Russia. I mean, the significance of that cannot be underestimated. There are also several issues they have to discuss which have implications for the rest of the world, particularly if they can agree on an energy deal where they can extend the current agreement, which expires March next year, whether they can extend it for another year. In which case, of course, both of them win in the sense that oil prices will be relatively stable, and that is what they want. But over and above that, they will also, I'm sure, discuss Syria and possible compromises and solutions there.
Karen, what does it say about Russia and Putin's stature?
The name is Karen, by the way.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Well, you know, Vladimir Putin has been trying to recreate the Soviet Union for almost the entire time he's been Russian president. And part of that involves spreading his influence into the Middle East and West Asia. We've seen already actions he's been starting to take in Afghanistan, for example, getting interested in what's happening in Iran and now in Saudi Arabia. Russia sees this very much as their sphere of influence. So as much as anything else, this is Vladimir Putin reminding the West that for all the fact that countries like the US see this as their sphere of influence, Russia also has a claim there.
Nandan, is this the clearest signal yet of perhaps an admission by the Gulf states that Russia is a player and a major player in the politics of this region, and it is something to be a force to be reckoned with as the Syrian war approaches endgame?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I don't know about the Syrian war approaching the endgame, but the fact that Russia is now a significant player, and whatever solution the world thinks of for Syria, that solution cannot be implemented without Russia is undoubtedly true. And I think to that extent, Putin will be proud that he has managed to sort of re-inject Russia onto the world scene and maybe capture some of the aura that the former Soviet Union had.
Kiran, Russia is now the largest country outside of the oil producers cartel of OPEC that is following the plan to curb production. How much of this coming together of Saudi Arabia and Russia is about oil?
I'm sure that's a lot of it. I think Saudi Arabia feels very under threat right now. US shale has completely changed the dynamic of power among particularly the Middle East and oil-producing states. OPEC is almost now irrelevant. They can try and curb production if they want, but it's not necessarily going to set prices. The shale producers have become the price setters, which dramatically shifts the center of geopolitical power, at least as far as oil's going. So, if Russia can be persuaded to follow the OPEC line, that will make some difference. But the fact is that the shale producers have become so big that it would take quite a significant alliance. I mean, if, for example, Russia decides not to follow the OPEC line, which if it's not in their interest, they won't do, then it'll have no impact at all.
What is the message here for Washington, Nandan, according to you? Perhaps Riyadh's enthusiasm for Donald Trump is fading as they see no clear solution in sight for Iran's expansion and growing power.
Well, the message to the United States, I guess, is only one, and that is something that the Russians have been emphasizing repeatedly, is that everyone needs to talk. But the United States currently is going through a phase where anything that is wrong is Russia's fault. So it's difficult to see them coming to a table. Although the Rybkov-Shannon talks are quietly proceeding in the background. So there is chance that the United States and Russia may find common ground in Syria, which will obviously imply that they will get the Saudis and the Israelis on board. More important from an Indian perspective is, will the Russians and the Americans find common language on Afghanistan? And that, I'm afraid, is not something that's likely to happen very soon.
Kiran, how do you see it from Washington's point of view? What sort of strategic challenges does this emerging alliance pose?
I don't think Washington's necessarily paying it that much attention. Washington has its own things to focus on. Washington is trying to figure out what its policy all over the world is, whether or not it should keep its very strong alliance with the Saudis, what the scrapping of the Iran deal, which we've been led to believe is imminent, what that would mean for any alliance with the Saudis. And of course, let's not forget that the king is not going to be there for that much longer in Saudi Arabia. We expect the crown prince to take over anytime soon, and that could lead to a change in policy completely. So I think Washington probably will be happy to let the Saudis get on with whatever they need to get on with. They've got their own problems to fix right now.
Interesting you mentioned the Crown Prince, because there are also questions on why the 32-year-old did not join him on this trip, Nandan, and that is something that is being talked about, and the statements coming from the Saudi government haven't been able to really clear the air on that one.
Well, it's self-evident that the Crown Prince is set to inherit the mantle. But of course, it would help if there are not too many missteps. So if they can come to some kind of understanding with the Russians on Syria, and if they can also somehow finesse the problem in Yemen, then I think the Crown Prince taking over is a shoo-in, as it were. But if these problems persist, then maybe those who are opposed to his taking over may find some courage to start opposing it more publicly.
Kiran, would you say that Russia is now the best bet for these Sunni countries as they look to somehow reign in Tehran?
No, I would say that Washington is still their best bet. I mean, it looks like the US is about to pull the plug on the Iranian nuclear deal, which would be a huge boon for the opponents of Iran in the Middle East. The fact is that while Russia tries to project itself on the international stage, it is still not really in a situation to be able to do so. Its economy is very weak and has been ever since the oil price collapsed. It doesn't have the kind of military power, although it does obviously have these occasional military forays into its immediate neighborhood, but it doesn't have the kind of military power to project itself on the world stage. Vladimir Putin tends to talk a very tough talk, but Russian power is much less significant than American power as far as the rest of the world is concerned.
Let's talk about the men in charge in both these countries. Nandan, from Libya to Sunni Arab Gulf states to Iran, Israel, Egypt, would you say that over the years Vladimir Putin has shown a remarkable ability to transcend traditional regional divides?
Well, he is pursuing what he thinks are Russia's national interests. It also helps that the current confusion in Washington appears to have created a vacuum, giving him a chance to step in more boldly, because he knows that the reaction from Washington will be tepid at best. So in that sense, yes, I mean, he's transcended some of the lost ground, as it were. Not transcended, but made up some of the lost ground, which the Soviet Union had, and which the Russians lost soon after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I completely agree with Kiran, you know. Russia's ability to project its power in the long term is completely wedded to the success of its economy. And unless there are serious reforms and changes in the Russian economy internally, I don't think they will be able to sustain this for too long.
And the thrust of this visit and this meeting and whatever is being discussed between the two leaders, Nandan, is the economy, isn't it?
I beg your pardon, you'll have to repeat the question.
I'm asking you the thrust of what is being discussed between these two leaders and the engagements and what's on the agenda is economic.
No, I think the primary question will be economic, because they have to come to an agreement on the extension of the oil deal. That is something which is very, very important to both the countries. However, I am confident that there will be discussions on the geopolitical situation in the Middle East as a whole. And while they may not arrive at any kind of consensus, but at least they will know where each other stands.
Kiran, do you see a substantial breakthrough in, say, for instance, the situation in Syria, both sides backing rival factions here?
No, I don't. And, I don't think that either side has the power or the clout to be able to achieve the result that it might want in Syria. I suspect that Assad is too dug in now for his opponents to get rid of him. And there'll have to be some kind of negotiated settlement there that involves multiple powers come together, presumably with Assad still in power, but which will also involve the rebels as well. So I don't think that this is going to swing the war in Syria one way or the other.
Nandan, a word on the defense deals. The S-400 air defense system, I think it'll be the second time in a fortnight that after Turkey, it's the Saudis who are talking about buying this defense system, and we saw the reactions that came in after Erdogan made that announcement. How do you see Americans, for instance, responding to this?
Well, I really don't think that in the long term, the Saudis are going to move away from the U.S. I think that is a long-term alliance. And there may be some piecemeal purchases of military platforms from the Russians, but there is going to be no significant diversion of purchases towards Russia. And I do not see a significant military strategic partnership emerging currently between Saudi Arabia and Russia.
Kiran, who do you credit more for what we are calling, at least, Russia's rise? Is it Vladimir Putin's realpolitik or Donald Trump's politics or lack of it?
Well, I'd be interested to know what you mean by Russia's rise. I think, if anything, in the last few years, Russia has fallen quite considerably. Its economy is really in the doldrums. I think its people are suffering. I think its government is weak. And one of the reasons that Vladimir Putin tries to assert himself in the international...
Russia's rising influence in the region...
I don't think it does have a rising influence particularly. I think that Russia tries to... well, all right, let me put it this way. Vladimir Putin is very good at spotting an opportunity to get involved in certain conflicts in the world, Syria being the classic example, where he inserts himself in a situation where he realizes that his natural opponents might not be strong enough to resist him. He will take advantage of isolated situations like that around the world, but particularly in West Asia, to a certain extent, as a way to detract attention from what's actually going on inside Russia, which is that his power is weakening and the economy is much, much weaker than it was a few years ago. So I think to badge this as Russia rising would be a bad mistake.
Nandan, your thoughts on this?
Well, I will not agree completely with Kiran. I think the Russians have a serious problem with economy. But it is also true that their economy has got over the sanctions. I mean, all figures, even by Western sources, World Bank and everyone, shows that their economy is back on a growth trajectory. Yes, it's not significant. It's not 5 or 7%. It's only somewhere around 1%. But it is growth from negative. That the Russians are here to stay, yes. I think that they're here to stay for some more time. They have risen from their knees, let's say, but Russia is definitely not the Soviet Union. The second point is, and there I completely agree with Kiran, if the Russians in the near future do not undergo some kind of serious structural economic reforms, particularly in terms of privatization, then their economy is going to face very serious problems, which are going to be exacerbated by the current sanctions that are imposed on them by the West.
He's going into an election. He's jailed his political rival. Do you see Vladimir Putin, Nandan, taking the kind of measures that you're talking about?
He hasn't jailed any of his political opponents yet, in the sense that Navalny, the person who everyone projects, is in any case disqualified from contesting the elections. That happened about 3-4 years ago. So that is not an issue. In any case, whoever stands against Vladimir Putin today is liable to lose the election, because all said and done, his popularity with a majority of the Russians is genuine. So I think anyone who thinks contrary to that is, I think, misreading the situation. But as I said, if he is not able to significantly move the economy forward, if the current troubles continue, then of course there are chances that people are going to raise their voices against the current regime. But fortunately or not, by then he would have won his election.
Right, final comments, Karen Stacy. What is the most tangible takeaway that you foresee from this meeting and this visit?
Well, I imagine if there is some kind of deal on oil production, that will be a real, a very interesting moment and a real success for Saudi Arabia if they can get Russia to agree to move in lockstep with whatever they want to do on oil production. That will be a major success. And also helping to combat US power. You know, as you said, I think at the beginning of the show, the US has become a very unreliable ally, not just for Saudi Arabia, but for countries around the world. So just to have a backup option in place is not a bad idea.
All right. Of course, the Saudi monarch has taken a huge delegation with him, promising joint investment deals worth billions of dollars. So that should help the Russian economy too. Karen Stacy, Nandan Unnikrishnan, thanks very much. We were hoping to be joined by Dmitry Babich from Moscow, but that's unfortunately not happened. So I'm going to thank you both and wrap this discussion here.